Zhang Lei had never been much of a standout in the world. Just another high school chemistry teacher in a sea of thousands, blending into the routine of life like an indistinguishable note in a symphony of mediocrity. He was the kind of person who lived for the weekends, his weeks filled with the humdrum monotony of grading papers, dealing with rowdy teenagers, and staring at the ticking clock of his life that seemed forever stuck in the same place. But that was before the change. Before he had seen Zhang stood in front of his class, the chalk in his hand squeaking faintly against the blackboard as he jotted down formulas. His students were slouched in their seats, staring at their phones or doodling in their notebooks, clearly uninterested in his lecture about the periodic table. For them, it was just another boring day in school. For him, it was different. His body hummed with an energy he couldn't explain, an energy that had been growing inside him ever since the procedure. It had only been 3 weeks since the surgery. 3 weeks since Zhang had signed the consent forms without fully understanding what he was getting into. It had all sounded too good to be true, an enhancement, they called it, a genetic modification to enhance physical traits. The pitch was seductive, eagle-eyed vision, cheetah-like speed, ant-level strength. A future where a teacher like Zhang could outperform even the most elite athletes, all while staying in his mundane job. It was, in his mind, the ultimate shortcut. No more worrying about how to keep his students engaged. No more struggling to feel relevant. He could be someone, something, beyond ordinary. And so, he did it. The procedure. The surgery was simple. A few weeks of recovery, some minor discomfort, and that was it. But the changes came on fast. So fast that, now, as Zhang stood in front of his class, he could feel them pulsing beneath his skin. His eyesight had become sharper, his reflexes faster. Every movement, every sound, every detail had been amplified. He could see the faintest flicker of light from a cracked window on the far side of the classroom. He could hear the soft sound of a student's breathing, too quick, too shallow, a sign of anxiety. Zhang adjusted his glasses. The board was too far away for most people to read, but not for him. He could make out every letter, every number, no matter how small. It was almost too much to take in. The students were speaking, but Zhang wasn't really listening to them. He wasn't looking at them either, not in the way they thought he was. No, Zhang was observing them as a hawk might watch a rabbit in the wild. Every twitch of a hand, every glance away from the board, every hidden yawn, it was all recorded in his mind. The bell rang, snapping Zhang out of his reverie. The students shuffled to gather their things. It was another day, another lesson forgotten in the haze of youthful apathy. But Zhang couldn't let it go. Something inside him was burning. A primal hunger had begun to awaken. The desire to chase, to move, to do something with all this newfound power. As his students filed out of the room, Zhang lingered for a moment longer, standing by the window. He took a deep breath. Outside, the air smelled different. Sharper. Like the scent of earth after a summer rain, but also, something more. Something deep in his chest stirred, and he almost wanted to run. He laughed, shaking his head. Ridiculous. He was a teacher, not an animal. That evening, after a long day of lectures and faculty meetings, Zhang walked home, the cool wind brushing against his skin. The streetlights cast long shadows, stretching like fingers reaching for him. He could feel the muscles in his legs twitching as he moved, a constant reminder of the cheetah-like speed now coiled inside him. The world around him seemed to move in slow motion, each sound amplified, each image crisp and detailed in a way that was both exhilarating and unsettling. As he passed a street corner, he saw a group of teenagers gathered around a parked car, laughing loudly. Zhang's eyes fixed on them for just a moment too long, and one of the boys, noticing his gaze, suddenly stiffened. Zhang caught the movement instantly, like a predator sensing its prey. But then, just as quickly, he let it go. Control. Focus. He repeated the mantra in his head. The last thing he needed was to act on impulse. But deep down, something inside him wanted to. The next day at school, Zhang found himself growing increasingly restless. The classroom, once his domain, felt suffocating. His speed made him antsy, and his heightened sense of perception was a constant distraction. He could hear the faint heartbeat of a student in the back row, could smell the faint trace of perfume lingering in the air. It was all too much. During a test, one of his students, a boy named Xiao Li, began to fidget nervously. Zhang could see the boy's pupils dilating, his hands shaking slightly. He knew, without a doubt, that Xiao Li was cheating. He could almost hear the thoughts racing in the boy's mind. Zhang's heart began to pound in his chest, the pulse almost too loud for him to ignore. For a moment, it was as if time itself had slowed down. He locked eyes with Xiao Li. The boy's face paled. "Xiao Li," Zhang said, his voice calm, too calm. "Are you cheating?" The boy froze. The other students were silent now, watching. Zhang's gaze never wavered. His eyes locked onto the boy's hand, which was trembling ever so slightly, just enough to confirm his suspicions. There was a brief pause, then Xiao Li muttered, I wasn't." Before he could finish his sentence, Zhang was already at his desk, faster than anyone could process. He had moved like a blur, his hands coming down firmly on Xiao Li's cheating sheet, and in that instant, the room went quiet. The students stared. The air felt thick. Zhang's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, his pulse pounding in his ears. For a split second, he wanted to snap the sheet in half, to do something far more animalistic than what he had just done. But then, he inhaled deeply and took control of himself. He let go of the sheet. "You can leave now, Xiao Li," Zhang said. His voice was cold, almost detached. The boy quickly packed his things and fled. The students didn't speak. They didn't even dare. Zhang stood there, feeling the weight of the silence in the room, knowing that something deep within him was changing, something he couldn't control. That evening, as Zhang walked home again, he found himself drawn to the same alley where the stray dogs had fought the cat the day before. The scent of something feral hung in the air, and Zhang's eyes flicked to the shadows where he had seen the fight. The alley was empty now, but his senses were on high alert, as if expecting the confrontation to happen again. His heart raced, his body itching to move. He clenched his fists, feeling the power of the ants inside him, the strength that had once been theoretical now surging through his veins. He could feel the urge to act, to intervene, to do something more than just observe. He exhaled slowly. "Control, Zhang. You need control." But what if control wasn't enough? That night, in his apartment, Zhang lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the hum of the city outside, but it felt distant now, as though it belonged to a different world. Inside, his mind was racing, his heart beating with an intensity that matched his animal instincts. "What am I becoming?" He asked himself that question a dozen times, but each time, the answer seemed more and more elusive. The power inside him was undeniable, but it was also dangerous. It was wild. It wasn't just something he could turn off. For the first time in his life, Zhang felt like he was no longer in control. Zhang's world was beginning to warp, each detail increasingly vivid, each moment stretching out longer than it had before. It wasn't that he wanted to be different. He hadn't asked for this. But every day, every second, the power inside him grew, and with it, the tension in his mind. The urge to move, to run, to leap from rooftop to rooftop like some kind of animal was growing unbearable. It wasn't something he could ignore anymore. Not with the way his muscles burned with the need for speed, not with the way his senses buzzed, craving more. His reflection in the bathroom mirror had become unsettling. His eyes, sharper than they should be, glinted unnaturally under the fluorescent light. His pupils no longer looked like those of a regular man, they were deep, unblinking, like the eyes of a predator. Every time he caught a glimpse of himself, a fleeting thought passed through his mind: who are you? It was that voice again, the one that had started speaking to him when he'd first undergone the procedure, when the DNA alterations had been completed. It wasn't a voice, really. It was more of a pull, an instinct, something inside him that had been buried for years. Now it was clawing its way to the surface. That afternoon, as Zhang entered the school building, he felt it again, the tightness in his chest, the heat building in his veins. The scent of chalk dust, the sound of sneakers against the tiled floor, the murmurs of students passing between classes, everything felt exaggerated, amplified. His eyes darted around, trying to calm himself, trying to anchor himself to something familiar, but it was impossible. The first bell rang, signaling the start of class. Zhang shuffled into the room, his thoughts scattered. The students were waiting, as usual, half engaged, half interested. A few students greeted him with a half-hearted wave, but most kept their heads down, pretending to focus on the clock. Zhang, however, was no longer paying attention to the clock. He was watching his students too closely. He saw every movement, every subtle shift in posture, every micro-expression. His eagle-eye vision allowed him to pick up on details most people would never notice: the trembling hand of Mei Wei in the second row, her breath shallow and quick, the way Tong Jun's eyes flickered nervously toward the exit, the flick of a pencil in Li Xiu's hand as she chewed on the end, her gaze darting toward the window as if she wanted to escape. It was as if he could see beneath their skin, could hear their hearts beating, each thud of blood in their veins pulsing in his ears. "Zhang, you're staring again," Li Ming's voice broke through his reverie, jarring him back to reality. His colleague had entered the classroom, grinning, his hand waving in front of Zhang's face. Zhang blinked, shaking himself out of the trance. "Sorry, I was just thinking," he muttered, smiling awkwardly. Li Ming laughed. "Too much time in the lab, man. You've got that look in your eyes like you've been analyzing everything down to the last atom." Zhang chuckled nervously, but the comment struck a deeper chord. He had been analyzing everything lately. Every student, every movement, every sound. Everything had become data, every person a potential puzzle to solve, every situation a game. He felt the temptation again, the urge to move, to test his limits. But he buried it. "I'm just adjusting," Zhang said, a little too quickly. "New semester, new changes." Li Ming raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, he began talking about some upcoming staff meeting, but Zhang wasn't listening. His mind had already started wandering again, drawn back to his own thoughts. He had never felt more like an observer in his own life. Like he was standing outside of himself, watching someone else navigate his world. The next few days were a blur, each one passing by in a haze of heightened senses and jumbled thoughts. Zhang couldn't escape the way his body felt, every part of him hyper-aware, hypersensitive. The students had begun to notice the difference. They couldn't quite pinpoint what had changed, but they could tell. They saw it in the way Zhang moved, in the way he spoke to them with such quiet authority. But the strangest thing was the way they started to look at him. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but something like it. They no longer saw him just as a teacher. There was something else there, something that made them hesitate when they spoke to him, something in the way they sat up straighter when he entered the room. It made Zhang uncomfortable, but he couldn't help it. One afternoon, Zhang caught a glimpse of a student, Wu Tao, passing by the staff room. Wu Tao was a quiet kid, the type who always sat at the back of the class, never drawing attention to himself. But today, as Zhang caught his eye, the boy stopped for a brief moment. "You okay, Tao?" Zhang asked, his voice softer than usual. Wu Tao shifted his weight, his gaze flickering nervously. "Yeah, just wondering if you need help with the homework, Mr. Zhang." "I can stay after school, if you want," Zhang blinked. Something wasn't right about the way Wu Tao was speaking. There was an odd tension in the air, a subtle nervousness. Zhang's gaze followed the boy as he quickly walked away. He saw it now. Wu Tao's hands were clenched, his fingers twitching slightly, as though he wanted to run. It took Zhang a few moments to process what had just happened, but the realization hit him like a sudden blow. His students weren't just noticing his abilities, they were afraid of them. They didn't know what to make of him anymore, and neither did he. By the end of the week, Zhang felt like a stranger in his own skin. The changes were undeniable now. He could feel his heartbeat faster than before, pumping blood with more force through his veins. His muscles, once ordinary, felt as if they were charged with energy, waiting to spring into action. And his senses, everything felt more intense. He could hear the whisper of air conditioning in the next room, the subtle movement of a leaf outside the window. It wasn't just his vision that had sharpened, his sense of smell, his hearing, everything had heightened to an almost painful level. The pull to move, to run, was overwhelming. He'd resisted it for days, but it was getting harder to ignore. The animal inside him, the cheetah, the eagle, the ant, they were all awake now, pushing at the door of his consciousness, urging him to break free. It was late one evening, after a long day of teaching, when Zhang finally snapped. He was walking home again, his body restless, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. He could feel the tension building in his chest, the pressure rising like a spring coiling tighter and tighter with every step. He didn't even realize what he was doing until it was too late. Without thinking, Zhang broke into a run. He wasn't aware of the speed at first, but as his legs stretched out beneath him, he felt the ground blur beneath his feet. The wind whipped through his hair, and for the first time in days, Zhang felt free. He felt alive in a way he hadn't experienced before. The world became a blur of colors and sounds, but it was all too much. He had no control over his direction. His instincts had taken over completely. He was running faster than he had ever run before, faster than any human could possibly go. He leapt over fences, dodged traffic, and veered through alleyways without even thinking. His body moved as if it knew what to do, as if it had been training for this moment for years. He felt the power of the cheetah surge through him with each step, each bound, each twist of his body. But then, in a sudden flash of clarity, Zhang slammed into something solid. He fell backward, the world spinning as his breath caught in his chest. He blinked, disoriented, as he tried to focus on what had happened. It wasn't until he looked up that he realized he had crashed into a street lamp. Zhang lay on the ground for a moment, trying to steady himself, to catch his breath. The world around him was still spinning, but the adrenaline was wearing off. And with that fading rush, came the horror. What had he just done? Zhang lay on the ground, his breath coming in short gasps, staring up at the blurry street lamp above him. His chest heaved, the sound of his own heartbeat thumping in his ears. He blinked, trying to focus, but his head was spinning. His legs felt like they were still moving, still running, even though he was lying on the sidewalk, half-dazed and unsure of what had just happened. His hands trembled as he pushed himself up, palms scraping against the rough asphalt. He felt a dull ache in his shoulder where he had collided with the street lamp, but that pain was nothing compared to the one in his chest. Something deep inside him was breaking apart, splintering like a dam under too much pressure. He had felt the rush, the power, the exhilaration, the speed, but now, as he stood there in the silence of the empty street, he felt the weight of what he had done. He had lost control, the cheetah inside him had taken over, and now he was left in the aftermath, trying to piece together what that meant. The animal instincts were stronger than he had realized. They were more demanding, more uncontrollable than he had ever imagined. He had felt them creeping up on him in small ways, but this was different. This was a break, a complete rupture from the man he had once been. Zhang took a deep breath, wiping sweat from his forehead. He had to regain control. He had to get a grip on this before it consumed him completely. He started walking, forcing his legs to move at a normal pace, but even that felt like a struggle. He was hyper-aware of everything around him, the soft shuffle of his shoes on the concrete, the distant hum of the city, the faintest smell of fried food from a nearby vendor. It was too much, too loud, too fast. He wanted to scream at the world to slow down, but there was no one to listen. As he walked, he heard footsteps behind him. A shadow crossed his path, and instinctively, he tensed. He turned around sharply, his body poised like a predator, ready to spring. His heightened senses were on full alert. But when he saw who it was, he relaxed, just slightly. It was Li Ming, his colleague from school. Li Ming's face was flushed, his hands held up in mock surrender, as if to say, "I'm no threat." Zhang noticed the slight tremble in his friend's eyes, the way he was watching Zhang, sizing him up. "Hey, man," Li Ming said, his voice cautious. "You okay? I saw you running earlier. Didn't look like you were in a hurry to catch the bus." Zhang felt his pulse quicken again, the impulse to flee almost overwhelming. He took another deep breath, focusing on the words, not the frantic rush of his own mind. "I'm fine," Zhang said, forcing a smile that felt thin and hollow. "Just needed to blow off some steam." Li Ming studied him for a moment, his gaze flicking to Zhang's eyes. For a split second, Zhang saw it, the flash of recognition, the brief moment of realization that Li Ming knew something was wrong. But it passed just as quickly, replaced by a more familiar look, concern, maybe, or pity. Li Ming had always been the type to try and comfort others, to smooth over awkward situations, but tonight, Zhang couldn't help but feel the distance between them growing wider. "You sure?" Li Ming pressed. "You don't look like you're okay." Zhang's eyes flicked away. He didn't want to talk about this. He didn't want to explain himself. "I'm fine," Zhang repeated. "Really?" But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. He wasn't fine. He was more than just not fine, he was falling apart. His body, his mind, everything was changing, and he didn't know how to stop it. Li Ming didn't seem convinced, but he nodded slowly, letting the subject drop. "All right," he said, his voice softer now. "Just, if you need someone to talk to, you know where I am." Zhang didn't answer. He couldn't. Because deep down, he knew there was no one who could help him. No one who could understand what he was going through. This wasn't something you could talk about over a drink or a friendly chat. This was a transformation, something far beyond anything he had ever experienced. And the longer he ignored it, the harder it would be to control. That night, Zhang lay in bed again, his eyes wide open in the dark. He was too wired to sleep, too restless to calm down. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, most of them scattered and nonsensical, but one kept repeating itself over and over again: "What am I going to do?" His thoughts spiraled back to the moments when he had felt free, the moments when his body had moved with the speed of a cheetah, when his senses had sharpened to the point where he could see the smallest details, hear the faintest sounds. The power had been intoxicating, thrilling, and yet terrifying. But there was another part of him, a quieter part, that was beginning to recognize the danger in all of this. He was losing himself. The man he had been, the teacher, the calm, rational man, was slipping away, replaced by something wild, something primal. And he didn't know how to stop it. In the darkness, Zhang closed his eyes, trying to shut out the racing thoughts. But it was no use. Every time he tried to sleep, his body refused to cooperate. His muscles itched with the need for movement, and his mind kept circling back to the one undeniable truth: he wasn't in control anymore. He got out of bed and walked to the window. Outside, the city sprawled before him, its lights flickering like stars in the distance. He could see everything, the smallest details, the shape of the tree in the yard, the flickering neon sign across the street. His vision was too clear. It was like his mind was overwhelmed by it all, unable to filter out the noise, and yet, as he stood there, looking out at the world he no longer felt connected to, something inside him whispered, "This is what you were meant for." The voice, the animal side of him, was growing stronger. It was no longer something he could ignore. It had become a part of him, just as real and as alive as his own thoughts. Zhang clenched his fists, feeling the rush of power coursing through his veins. The ant's strength, the cheetah speed, the eagle's vision, they were all still inside him, simmering just beneath the surface. He had never felt more alive. But he had never felt more afraid. The question that haunted him now was no longer just who am I? It was what will I become? The next day at school, Zhang stood in front of his class, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. He had to pretend, for the sake of his students, for the sake of everyone who still believed he was the same man he had been before. But as he scanned the room, he saw their faces, eyes wide, uncomfortable, unsure. He could see it in the way they looked at him now, in the way they flinched when he spoke too sharply, the way they recoiled when his gaze lingered a moment too long. He knew what they were thinking. They weren't just seeing their teacher anymore. They were seeing something else. Something they didn't understand, and he didn't either. He glanced at the clock, his mind swirling with thoughts he couldn't keep straight. He needed to leave. He needed to run. But he knew that, if he did, he would be chasing something that might never let him go. The bell rang, and the students began to file out of the room. But Zhang didn't move. He just stood there, looking at the empty seats, his mind lost in the vastness of everything that had changed. There was no going back. Not anymore.